El Coss refuerza su liderazgo criminal como líder del Cartel del Golfo.
September 12, 2012. The man who had commanded one of Mexico's most powerful criminal organizations for nearly a decade was running out of time and running out of road. While burning blockades choked the highways of Tamaulipas and cartel operatives moved through cities trying to buy him one more hour of freedom, the walls were closing in. Just hours earlier, he had been the Gulf Cartel's supreme leader, feared across northeastern Mexico, wanted by two governments, worth $5 million dead or alive to anyone willing to talk. Now, somewhere inside a residential neighborhood in the coastal city of Tampico, Jorge Eduardo Costilla Sniches was about to discover that the empire he had spent 2 decades building could not protect him from 30 Mexican Marines in one afternoon. We are going inside the final 24 hours of Elcas, the Gulf Cartel's most ruthless leader. The roads of Tamaulipas were burning. The authorities were mobilizing. His organization was creating chaos across multiple cities trying to shield their boss from what was coming. And yet the ending, when it finally arrived, was not the kind of violent last stand that cartel mythology promises. It was something far more unsettling. This is the story of how a man who had survived years of cartel warfare, a man who had watched the Gulf Cartel fracture and reform around him, a man who had outlasted allies and enemies alike, lost everything in a single, quiet afternoon. And how the 24 hours that preceded that moment tell us everything we need to know about what criminal power actually is and what it actually cannot do. But before we get into that final day, I need you to first understand who Jorge Eduardo Costilla Sniches was before the Marines found him. Because the story of his final hours only carries its full weight when you understand the full arc of what brought him to that house in Tampico. A young man in Matamoros, Tamaulipas, takes a job as a municipal police officer. He wears a uniform. He carries a badge. He is, by every institutional definition, on the side of law and order in one of the most strategically important border cities in North America. Matamoros sits directly across the Rio Grande from Brownsville, Texas. It is one of the primary commercial crossing points between Mexico and the United States, a city through which billions of dollars of legitimate trade flows every year alongside everything that moves through the shadows alongside it. The young police officer understands this geography from the inside. He understands how the city works, how information moves through official channels, how power relationships connect local police departments to municipal government to the broader institutions of the Mexican state. That knowledge, gained on the legitimate side of the law, would eventually become something very different. At some point in the 1990s, Jorge Eduardo Costilla Sniches crossed a line. The exact moment, the specific decision, the precise chain of events that led a police officer into the world of the Gulf Cartel is not preserved in the historical record with the kind of detail that would let us reconstruct it precisely. What the record does show is the direction of travel. He moved from law enforcement into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Mexico and built himself into a figure that the government he had once served would eventually offer $5 million to capture. The Gulf Cartel was not a recently formed gang when Elcas entered its world. It was a mature organization with deep roots in Tamaulipas, built over decades by successive generations of traffickers who had recognized the same fundamental reality. Northeastern Mexico was one of the most valuable pieces of real estate for organized crime in the Western Hemisphere. Tamaulipas runs along the entire eastern edge of the U.S.-Mexico border, from the mouth of the Rio Grande at the Gulf of Mexico all the way inland. The cities of Matamoros, Reynosa, and Nuevo Laredo sit across the river from Texas border cities, through which enormous volumes of commerce flow every day. The port of Tampico processes maritime freight from across the hemisphere. Whoever controlled these corridors, who could move goods, people, and cash through this geography without interruption, sat at the center of something worth an almost incomprehensible amount of money. The Gulf Cartel's most powerful modern iteration was built under Ociel Cardenas Guillén, who consolidated control through a combination of organizational sophistication and extraordinary violence. Cardenas made one decision that would define Mexican organized crime for the next decade and beyond. He recruited a dedicated armed enforcement wing from former members of Mexico's elite special forces units, particularly the Grupo Aranville de Fuerzas Especiales. These were not ordinary criminals. They were trained soldiers who brought paramilitary discipline, tactical expertise, weapons proficiency, and military-grade operational thinking into a criminal organization that previously depended on street-level enforcers. The wing became known as Los Zetas, named after the radio call sign of their original commander, Arturo Guzmán de Sena. For a period, the combination of the Gulf Cartel's trafficking infrastructure and the Zetas' military-grade enforcement made the organization appear nearly invincible to rivals and to the state alike. It was an alliance that would eventually produce catastrophic consequences for the region, for the cartel itself, and ultimately for Elcas. Elcas built his career inside this structure during the years of Cardenas's dominance. By the late 1990s, he had become deeply embedded in the organization and had already drawn the attention of American law enforcement. In November of 1999, he was part of an armed group that stopped and held several U.S. federal agents at gunpoint inside Mexico. They were released, but the incident immediately earned him his first indictment in an American federal court. Whatever anonymity he might have maintained before that moment was gone. The United States government knew who he was. The incident also tells us something important about the kind of figure Elcas already was by the late 1990s. This was not a man who avoided confrontation with institutions when he believed he had the power to impose his will. Stopping and holding armed federal agents at gunpoint is not the act of someone who fears consequences. It is the act of someone who has concluded that he operates in a space where ordinary rules do not apply to him. That confidence would define his leadership years. It would also help explain why his eventual capture in a residential property without a fight was so striking in contrast. Then came March 2003, and everything changed. Mexican authorities arrested Ociel Cardenas Guillén, removing the Gulf Cartel's most powerful leader from the field in a single operation. The organization was suddenly leaderless at its highest level. That kind of vacuum can destroy a criminal organization, or it can accelerate the careers of the figures positioned just beneath the top. For Elcas, it was the latter. He emerged from the chaos of the post-Cardenas reorganization as one of the Gulf Cartel's principal leaders, a position he would hold for nearly a decade. According to contemporary authorities and analysts, Elcas controlled the cartel's daily drug trafficking activities while keeping a profile so deliberately low that only 2 photographs of him were ever made public before his arrest. In a world where visibility creates vulnerability, maintaining near total anonymity while running a criminal enterprise of that scale was itself a form of power. He was present in the organization's operations without being present in the public imagination. That invisibility served him for years. It also meant that when he was finally photographed, in handcuffs, in front of cameras in Mexico City, the image carried a particular kind of shock. The first real public face attached to a name that had been feared for years. Here's where it gets complicated. The organization Elcas inherited was not the same stable enterprise that Cardenas had built. Los Zetas, the armed wing that had made the Gulf Cartel so formidable, had spent years developing their own leadership structure, their own territorial ambitions, and their own revenue streams independent of their original employers. The men Cardenas had recruited from Mexico's special forces had not simply remained loyal enforcers subordinate to cartel command. They had become a power center of their own, with capabilities, contacts, and ambitions that increasingly pushed against the boundaries of their original role. The relationship between the trafficking organization and its enforcement arm had always contained the seeds of conflict, two powerful entities sharing territory and resources while their interests diverged over time. By 2010, those seeds had grown into an open rupture. The Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas split. Former allies became enemies, and northeastern Mexico, already one of Mexico's most dangerous regions, descended into a new level of violence that made the previous years look almost manageable by comparison. The scale of what followed in Tamaulipas is difficult to overstate without reducing it to numbers that obscure the human reality. Entire cities became contested terrain. Highways between major population centers turned into danger zones where travelers could be stopped, robbed, kidnapped, or killed by either organization depending on which side controlled that particular stretch of road at that particular moment. Truck drivers, the ordinary workers of the cross-border transportation economy, became both victims and unwilling participants in the conflict. Municipal officials who attempted to resist cartel pressure were killed or forced to flee. Journalists who reported on the violence faced threats, attacks, and death. The local police forces in some areas were so deeply compromised by years of cartel penetration that distinguishing between a law enforcement officer and a cartel affiliate became genuinely difficult. The state of Tamaulipas became, by some measures, one of the most dangerous places in the Western Hemisphere. Elcas sat at the center of this as one of the Gulf Cartel's principal leaders. He directed the cartel's violent operations against the Zetas across this contested geography, using, according to U.S. authorities who later prosecuted him, violence and the threat of violence as the primary tools of organizational control. The institutional damage to government, to communities, to ordinary civilian life accumulated year by year throughout this period. It accumulated quietly in some ways, absorbed by a population that had no other choice but to continue living alongside it, and dramatically in others, when specific incidents forced international attention onto what was happening in northeastern Mexico. The irony that Elcas had once been a police officer in Matamoros, had once been part of the institutional structure designed to prevent exactly this kind of violence, was not lost on the analysts who followed his career. The movement of trained personnel from law enforcement into criminal organizations was not unique to him. Los Zetas themselves were the most dramatic example of that pattern in modern Mexican history. Former special forces operators who brought military training into a criminal enterprise. Elcas represented a different version of the same phenomenon, not a soldier who became a trafficker, but a police officer who became a cartel boss, carrying institutional knowledge from one world into another. Years later, when elite Mexican Marines were hunting him through the streets of Tampico, the circularity of that history gave the story a particular edge. By 2012, the pressure had been building for years on multiple fronts. The U.S. State Department's $5 million reward for information leading to his capture had been outstanding long enough that every person in his vicinity was a potential informant. Mexican military and naval operations had been specifically targeting Gulf Cartel leadership in an accelerating campaign. And just 1 week before September 12th, Mexican forces had captured Mario Cardenas Guillen, LM1, brother of the imprisoned OCL, in a separate operation. Days before that, Juan Gabriel Montes Cermeo, another major figure in the organizational hierarchy, had also been detained. Each arrest created new intelligence, Each new intelligence narrowed the circle around the people who remained at large. The network around Elcas was contracting. He may not have known exactly how much, but the process was moving. Now listen closely, because September 12th, 2012 is when everything accelerates. The morning of that day did not begin with Elcas in handcuffs. It began with chaos spreading across Tamaulipas. Armed cartel operatives moved through cities associated with the Gulf Cartel's territory. Vehicles were hijacked. Trucks and buses were seized and used to create burning blockades on major avenues across 3 separate cities in the region. The disruption was visible across a wide area, not concentrated in one location. The sight of burning vehicles blocking major roads sent civilian traffic into confusion and brought city life to a halt in affected areas. Reports of the blockade spread through local media as authorities scrambled to respond, creating a picture of generalized regional instability rather than a single contained incident. This is a tactic that cartel organizations in Tamaulipas had used before during periods of military pressure: generate multiple simultaneous incidents across a wide geography to stretch security force response and create uncertainty about where the primary threat is actually located. Somewhere in Tampico on that same morning, Elcas was still free. We do not know exactly where he was at the start of the day. We do not know who was with him beyond the bodyguards who would later be arrested alongside him. We do not know whether he had any awareness of how precisely the intelligence surrounding him had already converged. What we do know is that he was in the city, in a residential neighborhood, in a house that would within hours become the center of a military operation. Whatever September 12th looked like from his position as the morning became afternoon, the chaos playing out across Tamaulipas was his organization's attempt to buy him time and space. Whether he knew it was being done for him specifically, or simply understood it as a response to the broader military pressure of recent weeks, that chaos was all that stood between him and what was coming. The hours passed. The blockades burned. Military and law enforcement resources across Tamaulipas were stretched across multiple simultaneous incidents, and somewhere in the machinery of the naval intelligence operation that had been building for months, fed by the arrests of Mario Cardenas-Guillen just 1 week before, by the detention of Juan Gabriel Montes Cermeo in the days preceding, by weeks and months of surveillance and intelligence work that had slowly drawn a circle around the Gulf Cartel's remaining senior leadership, a specific piece of information emerged. A vehicle, carrying heavily armed men, moving through the streets of Tampico. When a wanted cartel figure is being hunted, the organization surrounding him has clear incentives to generate confusion, not necessarily to protect him directly through armed confrontation with military forces, but to divert resources, complicate movement, create uncertainty about where the real threat is coming from, and force security forces to respond to multiple locations simultaneously. Whether the chaos of September 12th was specifically coordinated around Elcas's protection, or was a parallel response to the broader pressure of recent arrests, is a question contemporary reporting did not definitively answer. What the chaos could not do was stop what was already in motion. Mexican Marines received intelligence pointing to that vehicle carrying heavily armed men moving through the streets of Tampico. This was not a broad regional operation anymore. The pursuit had suddenly narrowed from an entire state to a specific vehicle in a specific city. Tampico sits on the Gulf Coast at the mouth of the Nuco River, a port city that had been part of the Gulf Cartel's operational geography for years. It was the kind of city where a cartel leader might reasonably believe he could maintain a degree of anonymity in a residential neighborhood while events played out elsewhere in the state. The Marines began following. The trail moved through Tampico's streets, through the Colonia Lomas de Rosales neighborhood, and eventually stopped at a single residential property. The manhunt had contracted from Tamaulipas to one house. As the afternoon moved toward evening, time was running out. Roughly 30 elements of the Mexican Navy's Marine Infantry assembled around the property. 30 trained combat personnel committed to a single residential target. Inside the house, Elcas had no way of knowing precisely what was positioned outside. The 5 bodyguards around him were armed. The organization beyond the neighborhood was still creating chaos across the state, still trying to be useful, still fighting a war on multiple fronts, while their boss sat in a residential home that was now completely surrounded. The Navy would later describe the operation as the result of an intense period of naval intelligence work, building directly on information gathered through the recent detentions of Cardenas Guillen and Montes Cermeo. At approximately 18:15 hours on September 12, 2012, just after 6 in the evening, with the day already filled with burning blockades and military movement across the state, the Marines entered the property. Inside, they found Jorge Eduardo Costillas Ninches. They caught him by surprise. And the man who had directed the Gulf Cartel's violent operations for nearly a decade did not reach for a weapon. He surrendered without firing a shot. The silence of that moment deserves to sit for a second. This was a man whose reputation had been built on fear, whose organization had been fighting a territorial war with Los Zetas for 2 years, who had been present when federal agents were held at gunpoint in 1999, whose name had appeared on a $5 million reward notice distributed by the United States government. The myth around Elcas, the thing that sustained his authority, kept people loyal, kept rivals cautious, and kept ordinary citizens afraid, was built on the idea that confrontation came at a price, that challenging him had consequences, that he was the kind of man who could not be simply walked up to and taken away. And yet when 30 Marines entered the residential property where he had been located, he offered no resistance. Mexican Navy officials later confirmed it explicitly. He was arrested without any resistance whatsoever. The myth collapsed in a moment. The feared cartel boss became a man in handcuffs. Why? That question does not have a definitive answer in the historical record. No private account from inside that room has been documented. But the circumstances offer reasonable frameworks. Elcas would have understood what 30 Marine infantry personnel in a residential property meant for the odds of successful armed resistance. He would have known what had happened to cartel figures who chose to fight. He may have assessed the situation in the seconds after the Marines entered and concluded that the calculation was clear. Or he may simply have been overwhelmed by surprise before any calculation was possible. The uncertainty does not diminish the moment. It deepens it. The man who had always been able to impose his will through violence or the threat of violence found himself in the one situation where neither option was available. 5 of his bodyguards were taken into custody alongside him at the property. 5 additional bodyguards were arrested after a separate confrontation in another part of Tampico. The men who had been responsible for his security in the final days of his freedom were now in custody themselves. The circle of protection that had surrounded him had not protected him. By the time darkness came to Tampico on September 12, 2012, it was over. The following morning, September 13th, a different kind of spectacle unfolded in Mexico City. Mexican authorities presented Elcas to the press at the Navy's Center for Advanced Naval Studies. The imagery was precise and deliberate, handcuffed, wearing a bulletproof vest supplied by the arresting authority, standing before tables arranged with seized assault rifles, gold-plated handguns, and encrusted jewelry alongside other confiscated valuables, surrounded by uniformed officers, facing a wall of cameras and journalists from Mexican and international outlets. Only 2 photographs of Elcas had ever been made public before his capture. A man who had maintained his invisibility as one of his primary tools of power was now being displayed before the entire world. The visual spectacle served multiple functions simultaneously. It was evidence, documentation of what the Marines had accomplished. It was political, a public demonstration that the Calderon security strategy was producing results at the highest levels of criminal organization. And it was symbolic, the reduction of a criminal myth to a single man standing beside confiscated property in handcuffs. Admiral Jose Luis Vergara told reporters that Costillas Sanchez had headed the Gulf Cartel and had secretly overcome internal divisions while directing violent confrontations against the Zetas across Tamaulipas and Nuevo León. The press conference placed every detail of his criminal history before cameras that would broadcast it across Mexico and around the world. A man who had operated through secrecy for nearly a decade was, in the space of a single morning, fully public. The political significance was considerable. President Calderon's security strategy had attracted enormous domestic and international criticism over the years of the cartel wars, with critics arguing that military operations against trafficking organizations had produced more violence than stability. The capture of Elcas, coming after several other significant arrests in recent months, provided the administration with concrete evidence that the campaign was reaching the highest levels of criminal leadership. But the analysts who covered the cartel wars understood what the press conference could not fully address. George Grayson, professor of government at the College of William and Mary and an expert on Mexican organized crime, described the capture as a tremendous blow to the Gulf Cartel, while immediately noting the complication. Elcas's removal could open opportunities for the Sinaloa cartel or the Zetas to move into the routes previously controlled by the Gulf organization. A power vacuum in criminal geography does not remain empty for long. It fills rapidly, often with something less stable and more unpredictable than what preceded it. The Gulf Cartel had demonstrated precisely this resilience before. It had survived the imprisonment of Ociel Cardenas Guillen in 2003. It had absorbed the killing of Ezequiel Cardenas in 2010. It had fractured after the Zetas split and continued operating in altered form. It would not simply cease to exist because Elcas was in handcuffs. The organization's ability to survive leadership losses demonstrated something fundamental about how criminal networks operate at scale. They are not corporations whose function depends on a single executive. They are distributed networks of relationships, territorial arrangements, and financial flows that can persist across leadership transitions, often fragmenting but rarely disappearing entirely when a central figure is removed. The story of Elcas did not end in Tampico. It moved to Mexico City, then across the border, then into a federal courtroom in Texas. In the years following the 2012 arrest, Elcas remained in Mexican custody while prosecutors on both sides of the border assembled their cases. The United States had long wanted him in American courts, where federal sentencing guidelines, the full investigative reach of the Drug Enforcement Administration and the FBI, and the resources of the Federal Prosecutor's Office could be brought to bear in ways that the Mexican legal system, despite its own capabilities, could not fully replicate. Extradition had become an increasingly important tool in the campaign against major trafficking organizations. It sent a deterrent signal to other cartel leaders and placed subjects under a legal system with more severe sentencing structures. On September 30th, 2015, alongside the trafficker Edgar Valdez Villarreal, known as La Barbie, Jorge Eduardo Costillas Sanchez was extradited to the United States. The physical transfer from a Mexican facility to an American one carried its own symbolic weight. Whatever influence a cartel boss might maintain through relationships and fear while held in a Mexican prison becomes essentially impossible to sustain inside the American federal system. The transfer severed him from the geography, the relationships, and the institutional environment in which his power had once operated. The federal case assembled against him was built around scale. U.S. prosecutors established that his organization had trafficked more than 10,000 kilograms of cocaine and more than 140,000 kilograms of marijuana from Mexico into the United States over the course of his leadership. These were not the quantities of a regional distribution network. They were the quantities of an industrial-scale enterprise that had been feeding drug markets across the American Southwest and beyond for years. In September of 2017, Elcas entered a guilty plea in federal court to drug trafficking charges and 2 counts of assault, including his role in the 1999 incident with the federal agents. On September 15, 2022, 10 years after the Marines entered that house in Tampico, a federal judge in Brownsville, Texas, sentenced Jorge Eduardo Costilla Sniches to life in federal prison. He was ordered to forfeit $5 million in criminal proceeds. U.S. District Judge Fernando Rodriguez Jr. noted that Costilla Sniches had led an organization that used guns and intimidation to maintain control, resorting to violence and killing to keep power. U.S. Attorney Jennifer Lowery stated it simply, "The life sentence speaks for itself." Justice had been served. The federal courthouse in Brownsville, Texas, sits across the Rio Grande from Matamoros, the same border city where a young police officer once wore a uniform and built his first understanding of how power worked in that particular corner of the world. The arc of Jorge Eduardo Costilla Sniches' life closed in the same geographic space where it began, on the other side of a river, and on the other side of every line he had crossed in the decades in between. Now let us walk through the full timeline of what Elcas's life actually looked like from one end to the other, because the sequence matters, and the distance between the beginning and the end is almost impossible to fully absorb without laying it out in order. A young man becomes a municipal police officer in Matamoros. He patrols a border city. He wears a uniform. He is on the institutional side of the law in one of the most contested geographic spaces in the hemisphere. At some point in the 1990s, he crosses into the world of organized crime. He becomes embedded in the Gulf Cartel under Ociel Cardenas Guillen. He builds relationships and rises through the organization's structure while maintaining a near-total public anonymity. In November of 1999, he is part of an armed group that stops and holds U.S. federal agents at gunpoint inside Mexico. He earns his first American federal indictment. The United States government knows his name. In March of 2003, Ociel Cardenas Guillen is arrested by Mexican authorities. The Gulf Cartel reorganizes around new leadership. Elcas emerges as one of the principal figures in that reorganization, assuming control of daily trafficking operations. He spends the next several years running one of Mexico's most powerful criminal organizations while remaining so invisible that only 2 photographs of him become publicly available. In 2010, the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas break apart, and northeastern Mexico enters a new phase of extraordinary violence. Elcas directs the Gulf Cartel's operations through this conflict. The U.S. State Department places a $5 million reward for information leading to his capture. September 2012 arrives, just days before the arrests of Mario Cardenas Guillen and Juan Gabriel Montes Cermeo generate intelligence that begins closing the circle. On September 12th, road blockades spread across Tamaulipas as cartel operatives attempt to create confusion. Marines track a vehicle of armed men through Tampico. The trail leads to a house in the Colonia Lomas de Rosales neighborhood. At 18:15 hours, 30 Marine infantry elements enter the property. Elcas is caught by surprise. He surrenders without resistance. 5 bodyguards are arrested with him at the property. 5 additional bodyguards are taken in a separate confrontation elsewhere in Tampico. On the morning of September 13th, Elcas stands before cameras in Mexico City in handcuffs. The first clear public image the world has of a man who spent years as one of Mexico's most wanted fugitives. 3 years pass in Mexican custody. On September 30th, 2015, he is extradited to the United States alongside Edgar Valdez Villarreal. 2 years later, in September 2017, he enters a guilty plea in federal court. On September 15th, 2022, he is sentenced to life in federal prison in Brownsville, Texas, and ordered to forfeit $5 million in criminal proceeds. That is the arc. From a Matamoros police station to a federal courtroom in Brownsville, on the other side of a river, in the same border geography where his criminal career was built. A circle completed across more than 2 decades. But here's the thing about the story that the timeline alone cannot fully capture. The most revealing moment in all of it is not the arrest itself. It is the silence of the arrest. A man who had built his authority on the threat of violence, who had spent years positioning himself as someone who could not be touched, who had directed a criminal organization through one of the most violent periods in Tamaulipas' history. That man did not fire a single shot when the Marines came through the door. Why did he not resist? That question has no definitive answer. The circumstances offer reasonable frameworks. Without inventing private motivations, we cannot know. Elcas would have understood what 30 Marine infantry personnel in a residential property meant for the odds of successful resistance. He would have known what had happened to cartel figures who chose to fight. He may have assessed the situation in the seconds after the Marines entered and concluded the calculation was clear. Or he may simply have been overwhelmed before any calculation was possible. Consider also the condition of a man who has spent years living as a fugitive at the highest level of law enforcement attention. The constant relocation, the restricted communications, the inability to trust anyone fully. The knowledge that every person nearby represented a potential $5 million informant. That kind of sustained pressure does not produce clarity. Whatever the precise combination of factors, Jorge Eduardo Costilla Snichez did not resist. He was taken alive. And that moment became the defining final image of his criminal career. He moved from controlling people and territory to living under institutional control. The transformation is total and it is permanent. Whatever influence he once exercised over roads, over plazas, over armed men, over the flow of billions of dollars of illegal commerce, no longer matters in the same way. His days are now controlled by institutional schedule rather than criminal power. His movements are restricted to spaces measured in feet rather than in the vast geography of northeastern Mexico. And here is something no one actually talks about. When the story of Elcas' capture is told, the Gulf Cartel, as a broader entity, did not disappear. It continued. It fragmented. It evolved into something more decentralized, and in some ways harder to target than its previous centralized form. The Metros faction that had been dominant during Elcas' tenure became contested terrain after his arrest. Different plaza bosses across Reynosa, Matamoros, and other cities began operating with greater independence from any central organizational authority. New factions emerged from the organizational rubble. The criminal market that the Gulf Cartel had served, the demand for drugs moving from Mexico into the United States, continued to exist regardless of who was arrested and who remained free. This is the hardest truth about cartel kingpin arrests. They matter. They disrupt organizations. they remove capable people from the field. They signal to others operating in similar spaces that criminal power has limits, but they do not eliminate the underlying market, repair institutional corruption, or rebuild communities that bore the cost of the violence. The economic incentives that created the Gulf Cartel did not change because one man was put in handcuffs. What Elcas's arrest did change was specific and real. It removed a capable organizational leader at a critical moment in the cartel's conflict with the Zetas. It disrupted the Gulf Cartel's command structure in a way that accelerated fragmentation that was already occurring. It accumulated intelligence through the arrest itself that helped authorities continue mapping the organization's structure and personnel. And eventually, it delivered a man who had trafficked industrial quantities of drugs into the United States, into the hands of a federal judge in Texas, where the law could reach him fully. The story of Elcas's life, from police officer to prisoner, also carries lessons about the institutional landscape of organized crime that extend beyond his individual case. The movement of trained personnel from law enforcement into criminal organizations represents a persistent vulnerability in countries where cartel resources can exceed those available to legitimate institutions. When a police officer enters a cartel's service, the organization gains not just another operative, but a person who understands how law enforcement works from the inside. Elcas brought that knowledge into the Gulf Cartel's operations. The Marines who eventually found him had to overcome it. The federal courthouse in Brownsville, Texas, where a judge in September 2022 sentenced Jorge Eduardo Costilla Sniches to life in federal prison, sits across the Rio Grande from Matamoros, the same border geography that made Tamaulipas the strategic prize for which Elcas had spent 2 decades fighting, became the setting for the legal conclusion of his story. He began his documented life on one side of that river, in a police uniform, on the institutional side of the law. He ended it on the other side, in a federal courtroom, with a life sentence and no prospect of release. The geography stayed the same. Everything else changed. What the final 24 hours of Elcas actually reveal is something more fundamental than a single arrest. They reveal the specific and limited nature of criminal power when set against the coordinated resources of 2 national governments working in combination. They reveal the illusion embedded in the myth of the untouchable cartel boss. They reveal that the roads through which Elcas exercised his authority were the same roads that eventually led the Marines to his door. The geography that made Tamaulipas valuable to organized crime, the border crossings, the transportation corridors, the ports, the cities, was the same geography that defined the search operation that ended his reign. Power can appear absolute until the institutions surrounding it finally bring enough intelligence, resources, and coordination to bear. When that convergence happens, even a decade of criminal dominance can collapse in an afternoon. Criminal empires depend on people. People can be arrested. Money can be seized. Networks can fracture. Territory can change hands. The leader is never as invincible as the image suggests. And the final 24 hours of Jorge Eduardo Costilla Sniches made that truth impossible to ignore. For years, Elcas had lived as though the roads of Tamaulipas belonged to him. On his final day of freedom, those same roads became the map that led authorities straight to his door. By the time the sun went down over Tampico on September 12, 2012, the Gulf Cartel still existed, but the man who had helped rule it was no longer free, and the final 24 hours of Jorge Eduardo Costilla Sniches had become the beginning of the rest of his life behind bars.